I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people on whose land we meet today, pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to my Aboriginal colleagues, many of whom I've worked with over many years. It's great to see so many people here on the same page around housing management. I want to talk to you about Bridge Housing's journey around strategic asset management. We have been on a journey to move towards looking at our systems and really preparing for growth. And I think some of the things we've heard today from the speakers from AHO in particular is that we're looking to have a trajectory of growth for Aboriginal community housing providers, and to do that, the fundamentals of your strategic asset management need to be in place to grow properly. I'd also like to say that the artwork that's featured here is from Jordan Adler, who lives in La Perouse. She worked with our Aboriginal Tenant Advisory Group to develop artwork that we can then use on our Aboriginal tenant fact sheets and at sign up, and that really represents the diversity of our operating area from the sea right out to Blacktown and the rivers in between. So who are we? We're a Tier 1 registered community housing provider, and we've been around for around 30 years. And I think we talked about the journey of different organisations and different partnerships and merger opportunities. Well, Bridge Housing is a result of a series of mergers and amalgamations that have happened over those 30 years, starting from a very small tenancy organisation of about 200 properties to what we have now, which is 1,900 properties under management. Of those properties, traditionally we're based in the inner city. Our head office is in Redfern, but now our operating area spans 20 local government areas, from the eastern suburbs right out to Blacktown, where some of our newer developments that we're building at the moment have been built out there. We have about 300 properties that are owned outright, and that was directly because of the nation building transfer of title to community housing providers. And it's so wonderful to hear a discussion about title being on the agenda for the AHO. From our perspective, it's critical. If you really want to build organisations that are viable, that can develop, that can do new things like shared equity models, we need to be talking about title, not just management. Of our properties, 1,000 are managed on behalf of the Land and Housing Corporation, and also we do a lot of fee-for-service management work for local government, who are increasingly getting involved in affordable housing and social housing development and management. And we also have the largest leasehold portfolio in Australia of 610 properties. So that's us leasing properties off the private market for social housing, and that obviously gives us some experience about working with private real estate agents and trying to manage those relationships, as well as providing a social housing product in places people need it. I wanted to take it back to tenant and who we work for, because we like to say in Bridge Housing, our tenants pay our wages, and that is certainly the case, and that's why the whole element around working for community is about tenants and putting them at the heart. And we believe that doesn't stop with asset management, because tenants are the best people to tell you how your assets are operating, the best people to tell you how your trades are working. And when you're starting to have discussions about things like divestment and investment, it's really important to take them on the journey. And for us, we've been on a process of doing that. We had a big community engagement focus. It's only very recently that we've gone back to basics and said, how do we include tenants in our asset management processes? And what we've been doing is getting them involved in the selection of tenderers for our head contract program that we have. We've been going out to communities and working with them to make decisions about the types of upgrade works we're doing locally. So as you can imagine, people have lots of priorities, but working through with limited dollars what you can do in a local community with tenants working beside you is that we're getting the best outcomes that we've had. So a lot of the works that we're doing on estate communities, for example, in South Coogee and Balmain, put tenants at the heart of our work around decisions about property upgrades and public space issues. We also use the traditional forms that everyone uses in the sector around tenant surveys to give that sort of approach. And we've most recently worked to look to invest in mystery shopping, using our own tenants to mystery shop the customer service that they're receiving from our staff at the front line. So we're really trying to create lots of opportunities for tenants to have a voice in our core business operations. That looks really complicated, which is our strategic management approach. But I think we talked about this, and Darren talked about it from a Victorian perspective. It starts with knowing your asset intimately and knowing where you are up to in the property life cycle. So we've started a rolling 3-year program of scoping every single property. We've now gone through that twice. Why that's important is that we really do know whereabouts things are due to fail, what properties are well maintained and understanded, and it helps drive the development of our asset management programs. It is a regulatory requirement as well, I should say that you have a rolling scoping program to understand your assets and go back to the component base of your properties. That also goes into our 20-year forecast model, and really what that is a model that looks at all of the components of the properties and where we need to invest over the long term. This is really critical for bridge housing because starting as an inner city provider, we have a huge number of heritage listed properties around the inner city, lots of properties that break all the rules around asset management, like they're over 100 years old. Now, most people talk to you and say there's a 40-year economic life of a property. Well, we're up to, 150 years in some of our properties and they're still going strong, but you really need to understand what the cost is going to be over the longer term, and all of the data that we receive from the scoping is costed into the 20-year forecast model, and it helps us plan around our asset programs over time. It's also helped some really big shifts in our funding away from responsive maintenance to planned maintenance as well. In terms of we also have a strategic asset management plan. That, once again, is a regulatory requirement that you're planning for your assets over a 10-year time frame. What's critical for us, I suppose, is with only 300 properties under ownership, our decision making around divestment and investment is much more constrained. So once you start owning all of the properties under your management, then you have to make very strong decisions about divestment and investment over time. And for us, it's still very much partitioned in a tiny component of the portfolio that we manage. Also wanted to say that part of the strategic asset management planning framework that we have, which is 10 years, is looking at the data over time and where the needs are emerging, and also looking at our current tenant base and where the needs are emerging. And like many community housing providers, we do have an ageing population amongst our tenant base, and some of those properties that are under management at the moment aren't necessarily going to meet their need over the longer term. And so when we're making decisions then about the properties that we're building, we're able to make some decisions about the property configuration that really meets tenant need. And once again, we don't believe that the 10-year strategic asset management plan is just an internal bridge housing document. That's a way of engaging our tenants in and them understanding the decisions we're making and why, and it becomes critically important when you start to divest certain properties over time. I want to talk about the shift from that's submerged in bridge housing towards a planned maintenance focus. So I think once you start to get to a certain scale, you really are making decisions about how you invest in programs, and this is where scoping becomes critically important, because through our scoping program the first time around, we were able to identify, looking at the scoping program and also the money that we were spending on response responsive maintenance, where the key areas of our properties were failing. And they were failing in things like roofs, sewers, and also having issues around trees in the neighbouring areas. So because of that, we were able to develop specific programs annually that responded to those key priority areas. And what it's meant for Bridge Housing is we are making a complete turnaround from a responsive maintenance approach to a planned maintenance approach. Now, yes, that's taken 10 years and it's been escalated over the last 5 years, but you can slowly see the shift in spend from responsive maintenance to planned maintenance. And the result of that is Bridge Housing is the second highest provider in terms of our relationship or spend between planned maintenance and responsive maintenance. The majority of mainstream community housing providers in the sector are still spending too much money on responsive maintenance and not planned maintenance. So just having that program of works, really understanding the asset and what you're spending can help reorient the way that you spend that money more effectively. What we've also seen as a result of that is that our tenant outcomes have shifted over time as well. Our satisfaction of tenants in their homes has shifted exponentially over time as we've moved through these processes with them. And of course, it also means that we are reducing our responsive maintenance expenditure over time. Now, I know that this is a controversial area because having worked in public housing as well, I've seen the good, the bad and the ugly of the head contractor model. But really, about 3 years ago, we decided we were going to move to a head contractor model at Bridge Housing. And the reason we did that is that we wanted to prepare for growth and scaling up. And we knew that when transfers were coming, they were going to be large-scale transfers and they were going to require some change in our systems. And moving to a head contractor model and working through how we would do that and work with our head contractors has been a process. We're now 1 year in. We've had an internal audit of that process and it's functioning very well. But I will say that, you know, a head contractor model that we're talking about at Bridge Housing isn't what we're talking about in public housing, because we have only a couple of thousand properties under management and we've split that between 2 head contractors so that we have some competitive tension and we can test the pricing that's going back. And I'd say for many organisations that are working there, it's the same issue you have with trades and panels locally where you're testing prices between different providers. We're just doing that through a head contractor model. And what it's meant for us is that we have reoriented our staff on the ground away from managing individual trades and different work. That's the responsibility of the head contractor, towards auditing and compliance. And so our technical staff are now on the ground auditing the work that our head contractors are doing, and they're auditing and checking with our tenants how that work's doing. And I forgot to mention that our tenants are really critical in this process. Our tenants sign off all the works that happen in their apartments or their homes, so that we've got another verification that works are being done as they're being said they're done back to us. And it's also meant that we've been able to focus on engaging with those trades and those head contractors around our programs of work and doing it much more effectively in a way that doesn't impact on our tenants as much as we had previously done. And what we've done now is move away from going into people's houses and uprooting them and doing all that work to looking at how we do that through a vacant management process, and then a very clear program of work around upgrades that engages the tenants more closely. I'd also like to say that we've moved to an online system to help us with our compliance of all of the trades. We use CM3, and that helps make sure that both the trades and all of the subcontractors are up to date with their WHS requirements, their insurances, and we have that all managed by an external company. And I'd encourage you, if you're getting to that scale, to have a talk to them to help you with that process, because it does help compliance make your compliance much easier. as I said, we've moved now away from managing individual trades and tendering out on individual tiny bits of work towards a contract management approach, and that's meant that our staff themselves have had to change and train up and get experienced in contract management. It's not an easy feat to know your own contract and then to be able to work with your contractors under that framework, but they bring the skills that they have around their technical skills to play as well with the contract management, and it's been quite a change. And I can't stress enough what that actually means in your organisation when you start changing those processes in terms of culture change for your asset delivery staff when they're moving to contract management as opposed to managing trades on the ground. And we've got a little bit of an audit overview there around what our technical staff do and the way that we include tenants in that audit process as well. So I'd like to wrap up by saying that from our perspective, as Simon says, moving to an audit, to a rolling scoping program where you understand your properties, where you use a scoper that actually does go down to the individual components. Not all scopers do. We learnt our lesson by having some come in which was a very high level scope that provided no detail and no ability to map costs. You really need to go down to components, and you need to know the cost of those components, and you need to understand that in your modelling if you really want to inform programs. If you can financially model it, you will know it will also help you make decisions about divestment and investment, which is particularly critical for, I think, Aboriginal community housing providers that own their properties. There's lots of community housing providers that don't have that ownership. They don't have that driver to make the best out of their assets, because once you identify a property and you say we think it should be divested, that money goes back into the Land and Housing Corporation and into a central pool of money. It doesn't go back to you as a community housing provider, and I think we need to start talking about how we do that, because it's not encouraging best practice, I think, across the sector. Moving from a plan to a planned maintenance approach does take time, and it is supported by those other tools. Like Darren in Victoria, we use SDM as our management framework for both housing, our asset management and our financial management. They're a UK-based provider. They've got their challenges, but as Darren said, they are integrated, and we've been able to work through that system, and it's for the first time enabled us to enter that information directly into the system and be able to issue works orders from the system and not have to have a whole external process involved as well. The head contractor model has been really useful for us, but I do think that there's a scale issue. And the reason that we moved down the head contractor model was because we were getting larger and larger, and we were managing all of these properties, and we needed to take a step back and have someone else doing that nitty-gritty for us so that we could focus on the big picture, compliance, audit and quality of our properties. Of course, that's going to be very different for different areas, and being a metropolitan provider, we have a lot of service providers in this area that already work in the space, so that wasn't an issue either. So I recognise that depending on where you are, the head contractor model has different challenges and might not be the thing that you want to move down straight away. And also, I just wanted to finish off by saying, you know, for us, having tenants involved in asset management is really critically important, whether that's just talking to them about the way that works are happening and the way they're using their properties, or really involving them in the decisions about programs of work in their local communities. They understand you can go through a process which moves outside an individual interest in your own property and actually engages you on a broader issue about what's best for our community and our public space. And so I'd like to just say, yeah, no bridge housing tenants here today, but they really have been critical on that journey with us. Thanks.
Just in the interest of testing to see if everybody's still awake, no offence to Rebecca, more about me. We're going to have one question for the panel members as we go, and then we'll hold some open for the end. So anything in particular that somebody had that they wanted to ask Rebecca? I'm going to pose one question, not so much, or at least say we certainly at the AHO, we know, I'm looking at Ashley Livingston there, our repairs and maintenance manager, but our mixture of planned and responsive is a third, and I'll say what the other third is. So it's a third totally planned, a third vacant, which we agree the best time to go into a house is when it's empty, notwithstanding that you're not collecting rent. And then the other third is ring, my tap's busted, responsive maintenance. So I'm not suggesting for a second that that's necessarily best practice, but 2/3 is planned or semi-planned, and the other third is literally, as I said, picking up the phone. So I'd ask everybody here today to, if you don't know that number off the top of your head, probably you should, because it's something where we've got ahead. Because we all know responsive, getting trades out after hours is far more expensive than getting them done during planned work. So we do have the microphone. If anybody had one particular question for Rebecca, or if not, we can hold ABS. Okay.
Okay, so I've got one question for you because it's been coming up a bit in some work that we've been doing. So previously Aboriginal housing providers was 1.5% for planned and responsive maintenance, and when we did some work a couple of years ago, it actually came out that the amount of money that needed to be spent on planned was up around the $4,500. Depending on the property. So obviously I'm sort of interested to know, with your properties, based on the asset scoping that was done, would you know what the boundaries were for a minimum amount of planned up to, say, a maximum amount? Because if we work on 1.5% or 1%, which was at the value, so in some places it's going to blow everyone out of the water. So when you're looking at social rents, you're never going to get the amount of money that you need to put away for planned. So we have a situation where we've got providers who are spending money that they have in the bank, not on money that they actually need to spend on the planned maintenance. So I'm just curious as to get an idea on scale what that would be for, say, like what you've learnt from Bridge doing that work.
Look, we don't spend... We do this to have fun in my team, where we look at every single scope in the year and we say, what would that mean for our budget next year? So our budget this year is about $4.1 million on maintenance, responsive and planned maintenance. If I included every single element of the scope, we'd probably be somewhere like $8 million. So we go through, everyone has to, and it's like your own place, everyone has to go through a prioritised exercise. And what we do at Bridge is that we not only scope so that we know where everything is up in terms of the property life cycle, but then we rank those works in terms of their priority. And we sort of have a risk matrix, which is risky and medium and then low. And I could say most of the time low is going to be the things that other providers are talking about, which is kitchen replacements where they've not reached the end of their life and things like that. But anything that's high risk or medium, we usually will put into our program. But we're not by any means meeting every element of the scope of every property that comes back over the program. So I think it's always a prioritisation exercise within a prioritisation. But what we've seen over time is that those items most likely to fail, which become your responsive maintenance, if you're picking them up consistently over your scope and you're having programs around them, you're less likely to be spending money. And so, you know, particularly 10 years ago at Bridge, our costs, you know, our CEO used to say, whenever there was a huge bad weather episode, how many roofs were leaking and what were going to be the costs for that. But gradually that just doesn't happen anymore because we've been able to include those in programs. But by no means we meet everything that's needed in every property.